Hey everybody, how's it going? Corey here from ThemeCo with another episode of Repro. And for today's layout, I want to take a look at this Apple AirPods page that I found when I was browsing through their website looking for something fun to break down for this video series. What I particularly enjoyed about it was this table here, which I thought would be a really fun little case study to see just how far we could take our rows in the builder in recreating that. So get a good kind of mental snapshot of the page here because we're going to jump over to the tool now and run through each section one by one. Now I'm really happy with how the page came together. I think that we really captured the spirit and the feel of the design here. And what I really want to do is kind of walk you through my design decisions that I made along the way, as well as some alterations I made in terms of managing things a little bit more easily, I felt, than how some things were done on Apple's website. And again, there's no real right or wrong here. It's simply a matter of how you want to tackle these things and what works best for your particular workflow. So starting with the page as a whole, there's a couple different ways I could see breaking this down. For example, we've got this kind of black background here that is containing all of this content and runs all the way around it. So I could see placing all of that inside one section and doing these as individual rows. However, for my particular design, I actually ended up using multiple sections here. So you'll see that we've got a section around this row, section around this row, and then what I did was put the same black background on each of those sections, and then the rows inside are simply contained, and then they have more styling and more content inside of there. So again, not really a right or a wrong there, just how I chose to approach it for this particular example. Next, for the font we're using, we are using Roboto from Google Fonts. It's a very similar font to the San Francisco system font that Apple uses across all their devices. Got a very similar look and feel, so we're able to get that using that font from Google Fonts. Now that we have those kind of macro pieces out of the way, let's just break this design down piece by piece. So starting with the intro here, there's really nothing too special. We've got 2 lines of text, headline and a subhead here. And at first when I started making this, I was using one headline element along with the subheadline element that comes with that piece of markup we can use in the tool. Remember, we've got this subheadline setup that we can use to style these pieces. However, when looking at the design, I realized that the subhead was actually brought in a little bit further than this headline up here. And since we can't put independent max widths on the subheadline within the headline element, I actually ended up making this with 2 headline elements. And I just renamed this to subheadline here just to keep track of it a little better. So these are simply 2 headline elements that I've got here. And you'll see that I set up a base font size here. I was kind of going with a mobile up approach for this design. So 48 is the font size that you'll see right here that we're using on sort of our smaller screens. And then I'm using a bit of Element CSS on the section itself to kind of silo these styles to these headlines. And all I've done with that is pick a couple breakpoints where I want those font sizes to change. So here's my first change at 767 pixels and up. And since this custom CSS is on the section, this L placeholder will be swapped out for the class on that section. And then I'm simply targeting the text elements inside that section. And since I've only got 2, I can do this safely. And then I'm just targeting the first child for my main one here and the last child for my subhead. Now, if you're not familiar with the first child and last child pseudo classes, that is just a facet of CSS that we can use to target certain elements within other elements without having to explicitly add a class to that element. The only other way I could target these separately would be to go into each element here, jump to the customize section and add a class, and then do the same for my subheadline. But I can do that since I've only got these 2 elements in this section. I can simply do it with the first and last child pseudo classes, and that'll get me where I need to go with that. So that's kind of the nice thing too about siloing some of these custom styles to a section or a small bit of markup, is that you can use these more kind of broad classes because we're only working with this small subset of content here. And then finally, we've got our min width 979 pixels, which is where our large breakpoint starts. And you can see that the font jumps up one more time there. So that's really all we've got going on there. We've got our font sizes that we're changing, got a max width set on the text here, got our main headline here, and nothing too crazy going on there. All right, so next, let's jump down to this product section where we've got this kind of marginless column look, and we're comparing the two products here and just linking out to specific parts of the website to either learn more about that product or purchase it. Basically, all I did here was set up a row that's using 2 columns down to the medium breakpoint, and then it breaks down to 1 on my small breakpoint. I've set the vertical alignment to stretch so that both of these will match in height, and they're pretty much using the exact same content, so no real worries there, but this will just equalize them out. And then I've got 0 gap between the vertical and horizontal axis. And this is what's giving us that kind of seamless look here between these 2 columns. Now, one bit of custom CSS that I'm using for all of these first level rows on the page is I've got this class here of AA outer row, just a prefix I picked. And then we've got outer row here. And you can see here in the CSS for the page, I've got some styles here. And all I'm really doing was I was kind of closely approximating some of what Apple was doing on their website to contain these rows and get them to the dimensions that they're using. Now, Apple was kind of using a trick with some side padding here to bump these rows in and get the spacing here. However, something that I like to do, just to make it a little bit, I think, easier to process, at least for me personally, is to set a width and a max width and try and do everything with that. Since these rows get our container class, they're already horizontally centered, so we can rely on that and then play around with these dimensions to get it doing exactly what we want. So for example, on my smallest screen here, you can see we've got a width of 100%, but we have a max width of 500 pixels. And that's what's giving us this particular look right here. And that's keeping, all of these rows, these sections constrained like that for our smaller screen sizes. Then when we bump up to our first medium size here, you can see that our max width has jumped up to 1280 pixels. And really, I'm just setting it here for my much larger screens above this, because you can see this is for min width 767 pixels, which means any screen above this is going to get this rule here. And then I've used a calc statement here. And this calc statement is using 100% minus 50 pixels. So what that's basically saying is make the width of this row be 100% of the screen minus 50 pixels. So that's where I'm getting this small gap to the side here, because I'm subtracting that 50 pixels from it. And really what I'm giving it is a 25 pixel gap on either side, because it's going to be equaled out amongst that section. Next, if we go up to our large screen, you'll see that we've got the same gap here. Now, I put another rule in here because we could simply adjust this if we wanted to on a larger screen. We might want to say 80 pixels, which would mean we now have a 40 pixel gap on either side here. But I just left it the same, but I did put it in because we can tweak it later if we want and make it a little easier to work with. And then finally, on our largest screens, we've got this rule of 100% minus 120 pixels. And then ultimately, once all this goes away, our max width will take over and ensure that the sections don't keep growing and growing and growing out to the edges of the screen. So again, that's just a bit of custom CSS really for all of these first level rows here. You can see that they've all got that outer row class on there. So jumping back up here, I want to talk about these columns. I've got a little bit of padding to the side here, left and right, which is going to constrain my content just a little bit, and some top padding to push things down here. Next, we've got a title in each column here. And again, you can see that for all of these elements, we are matching our values exactly. So same font size, same font weight, all that stuff to ensure that things line up just the way we want. So we've got our two titles here, just a little bit of setup there, nothing crazy. Then for these button actions, what I'm actually using here is a nested row. So I've got a row here. I'm renaming it to actions, as you can see in the tooltip there. And then I actually gave each of these rows a class of AA actions here. And again, if I pop over to my page level CSS, the one thing you'll see here is that on screens of 979 pixels and up, I chose a font size of 22. And I was kind of doing this for the actions and for this text up here with these pixel font sizes. I started by kind of matching the original design exactly. And then in a couple spots later on in the page, I deviated a little bit just to show that, we can take some of these things as examples, but then learn and expand on them as we go forward in our own designs. So just wanted to kind of show you that was possible to do this technique of basically setting up a base font size, which is passed down to my buttons here, and then we can override it on a larger screen with a bit of custom CSS here. As for the general structure of that row, I've got it set to align horizontally to the center, and then I'm just stretching the vertical alignment here. And then I'm using the gap width to set the spacing between the two buttons, because remember, this is a row, so I've got two columns in here and a button in each column, and I can take this value and I can make it whatever I want to space those buttons out. So that's a cool trick. And then because of the general setup of the button, I don't have any gap height, because if they were to wrap at some point, they'll just kind of stack nicely on top of each other there. Now the trick to get this all working is to go up to our layout here and set each breakpoint for this row to auto. And again, if you've seen my videos in the past on auto-responsive layouts, you'll know that using this value on our Flexbox powered row sets the flex value of each column to auto, which effectively allows that column to just fill the space of the content inside it. So you'll see that, this column is just a little bit bigger than this column because the buttons inside them are respectively larger or smaller. So that's a cool trick that I like to use whenever possible. Now going back to the main site, all we've really got going on here is kind of an underline style on hover. And I wanted to do something just a little bit more kind of, take the same idea, but play around with it some. And you can see that we've got our particle effect here on the button that is growing to underline that text whenever we hover over the button. So all I did for that was turned our primary particle on. It is set to the bottom left corner on the inside of the button, and it's scaling on the x-axis. So you can see it growing there from the bottom left corner. And then the transform starts from that same corner. So that's why it's growing to the right, because it's starting from the left. I've just set up the width for that particle. It's got a 2 pixel height, and then we have a color to match our button. So that's how we're getting that effect right there. And for the width, what I really did was basically just set a little bit of an offset here to account for our caret to the side here. So that's why the line basically stops right at the end of the text, similar to our example over here. Now, one thing that I did differently for these images compared to Apple's setup is these are both differently sized images. They kind of start right at the edge of the product here where you'd expect it to. And they're also being set as background images on a figure element. Now, because of that, the size has to be explicitly set at different breakpoints. And we've got different sizes here we've got to manage across all of our screen sizes. And while that works, and if there's a powerful bit of content management going on behind the scenes and we want to put in that effort, we can do that. However, I think it's much easier to simply use an actual image element in here. Now the trick I did for this was you'll see that these are both the same dimensions. This image right here is 369 by 407. And actually those are the retina dimensions. This is the real dimensions here. And then when I turn on the retina sizing to bring it down, that's what we've got. And if I click over here, you'll see we've got the same dimensions. So the trick here is that you'll notice this image is a little wider than the actual product in here. And this image is a little taller than this product, but both of these images match dimensionally. So as I resize the screen down, you'll see that they resize at the same rate. So the great thing about that is that it will just responsively take care of itself, and we don't have to mess with using custom CSS to change this up at different breakpoints. It will just take care of itself, and it looks great across all of these different breakpoints. So that's a little change that I made there that I think is a huge improvement in terms of just general management and not having to add too many custom styles to things. And of course, for both of these columns, we've got no padding at the bottom, and that's what allows these images to align up at the bottom of the column and be set up like so. All right, so next we have our table section. Now this was really fun to kind of work on and just figure out the best pattern that we could fit everything into. So I took a moment to kind of look at Apple's example, see how it works responsively. We've got a little bit of a different look here on mobile versus our desktop setup. And if ever I'm looking at a design like this, or I've got something I'm trying to work on, the biggest thing I'll always do is I'll try and start from the similar parts, the patterns that I can, glean from the setup, and then I'll work on anything that's special or different at the very end. Now, when I look at this, it's obviously this portion here. We've basically got a line for our table. We've got a side label here that sometimes will have a bit of subtext here if we need it. And then we've got our 2 columns of features. Sometimes these are set up to use text. Sometimes they're set up to use icons. And if I look at the details just a little bit more, we can see that, at least on our desktop setup here, the label size is matching the text size over here. On mobile, it does change a little bit. You'll notice this text gets a little bigger than our column text, but we've got some similarities there. And then we've got a little bit of vertical spacing at the edges of our cells here. Now, again, when I look at how this works responsively, I can see that each of these lines is divided with a border here on desktop. However, when we go to mobile, our 2 columns pop beneath each label, and the dividing line, the border between each line of features is gone, but now we've got a line between the label and the 2 columns of text here. Now, I'll show you exactly how I achieved this here in just a second, and I did change a few things up just to kind of keep the pattern a little more simple, because you'll see for here, we would have had to do something a little special for these. But I actually really like how it came out on the other design a little bit better personally. But yeah, this is pretty much our pattern on mobile. So we've got to take all those things into account when we're working with them in the builder. So how this whole section is set up is I've got my section here, and then we've got a row which is containing all of this with one big column that's wrapping all of this content. And if I click on that column, you'll see that I've got some top and bottom pixel padding, and then some side percentage padding just to bump this away from the sides. And what's nice about that is it will dynamically respond and get smaller as the screen gets smaller. Now for each one of these features in the table, we've basically got a row that's set up to use a 50-50 layout. I've got one column to the left here that I'm calling my label, and then I've got another column to the right which I'm calling my data columns, which is going to hold the info for each product that we're comparing. Inside of that data column, I've actually got another row, and that row is using a 50-50 layout for each of these features. Now, this row never changes. It's always 50-50. And why that is because remember on mobile, when this breaks below, we've still got a 50-50 layout for these features. So that will always be the same and never changes. And that's pretty cool. And I realized that when I was looking at the pattern. So really what I kind of saw was that the pattern is 50-50 on desktop, and at some point this needs to break below. So for our feature row up here, that's why on medium and down, we go to a single column. Now on all of these feature rows, I did put a compare row class, and then I had a modifier of is feature. And I've got that modifier because for this particular row, it has the compare class here, but it has the is head class. And that's just kind of giving me a little bit of a different hook to style some things for this header row at the top here once we get back up to it. The final bit of custom CSS we've got going on is the 50-50 row here for our data. I'm just calling that compare data. So for each of these feature rows, if I click into it, you'll see that we've got our base font size set up here of 17 pixels. And the nice thing with that is if I set my font size up here and I set the font size of this headline, this text, to use just 1M, I can then come to this row if I wanted to later on, and I could change it to 27, let's say. And you'll see that all text inside of all their respective columns will be updated accordingly. So use these tricks whenever you can. Try and set your base font size at the highest level whenever possible. And then whenever you need to make tweaks later on down the road, you can just come to one place to change it rather than changing it across each element here. As for the situations down here where we've got a little bit of subtext, again, this is perfect for the headline element as it comes with a built-in sub-headline feature. So we can simply turn on our sub-headline, enter in that text, get that spacing, set it up the way we need to. For this, I was just using 14 pixels across the board because I felt it worked well even down on these mobile situations. And the cool thing about this is once we've set it up, if down the road we needed a headline that we decided needed some text so we wanted to add, we could simply turn on that sub-headline. We've got it all set up with the text, the spacing, the styling, all ready to go. For the icons in some of these columns, I'm actually using our icon element. So it's just set up to 1M, and then I found an icon that matched. And then over here, I'm using this line, I think it was called a horizontal rule. Just gives me the long dash that I need for a few of those situations. Now, if we click on to the section here, I've got some kind of siloed custom CSS. And if we break it down, we'll see that it's really not that crazy. Starting from kind of the base styles here, again, I was doing a kind of mobile up approach. So let's start down on our smallest screens. Any of these compare rows, you'll see I've got compare row plus compare row. I've got this margin top of 35 pixels. And that is what's pushing each of these away for my mobile devices. I'm going to ignore this for right now. We'll come back to that in a second. The other thing for this setup is you'll see that for our max width here, so I'm actually going down on this media query, anything that's smaller than 978 pixels, I'm targeting this headline here and just bumping its size up just a little bit. So it's 21 pixels for the smaller screen sizes. It just looks a little bit better for this particular layout. Then for right here on my large screens, if we jump up here, you'll see we've got this compare data. Remember, that's our row here around each of these. And then I'm targeting each column inside there, which is, if I click into it, just so we can look at it, each column inside this row is using our Flexbox layout. We've got it set up to row, and we are start aligning it both horizontally and vertically. Now, the reason why we're doing that is, again, we're thinking mobile up. So we're starting with these items aligned to our start, both horizontally and vertically. On our larger screens, however, that is where this bit of custom CSS comes in. And all this is doing is just targeting our Flexbox properties and ensuring that all of our text inside these columns and all of our content is centered, both horizontally and vertically. Another little change we've made here is a little bit of padding to the side of our first column here, basically our label. And then on this largest screen, you can see that we've removed that margin top from down here, and we've also put this border right here at the top of each row. So because of how that was managed, we did need to use a little bit of custom CSS to set up the dividing border on desktop. However, what I'm doing on mobile is using a trick that I've talked about in another one of our previous videos. So let me click into our feature row here. And you can see that the background for our feature row is actually this light gray. So if I change it to green, you'll see it change there. So what I've actually done is the background on this row is this color. And then inside my column here, the color is white, the background is white, matching the content here. And then also this row here has a background of white. So that white for this row and for this column is overlaying on top of my feature row. And that's what's allowing the background color to shine through here. So if I set this back to the gray that it was, you'll see that. And we're getting that mobile divider with our gap height. So if I change that to 0, that will go away. I could make it much larger if I wanted to at 4. We can get a little bit more of that. But how this is working is when I'm on my larger screens, this is set up to be a 50-50 layout. So I've got my 2 main columns here. However, when I break to one column on mobile, they're now being stacked. And once these columns are stacked, I have this gap height control I can use. So I'm using that as a little bit of a mobile hack to get this divider line showing up here. It's a really cool little trick. It's something that I love to use whenever possible. I really enjoy trying to find these unique ways to leverage the features of each element to reduce any custom CSS I might need as much as possible. So that's definitely a really cool trick to keep in mind whenever you're working on these sorts of patterns. So once I got all that set up, the only thing to work on from there was basically get this kind of head row set up. And you'll notice again, the content is aligned to the start, both horizontally and vertically. These particular columns have a little bit of bottom padding that's different from my other rows just to space these out. But on desktop, they of course get the same custom styles these do to center everything, both vertically and horizontally. And then the only bit of custom CSS for these really has to do for these much smaller screen sizes. So these images, once we get down here, they start getting a little bit tight. And so because of that, we want to reduce that size so that these can go down to a much smaller screen size. About 320 pixels is as small as you'll ever really need to worry about for mobile design. These days, I'd say it's more like 360 with how many of the dimensions work for the more prominent mobile devices. But this just ensures that you get a little bit of a nicer look on those smaller screens. And all we're really doing is targeting the X image element and setting a height of 90 pixels. Now again, both of these images have the same height. Even though there's a gap here, that gap is in the image. So I can set the height to be the same on both of these. And then for the actual image element inside of there, I just set the width to auto and its height to 100%. And all this really does is simply ensure that we don't get any weird distortions, which we don't want it to do there. So yeah, that's all we've got there. Now, on Apple's setup, on this mobile design here, this kind of label pops to the top. We've got this kind of line style matching with each of the AirPod labels here. Just to keep things simple in my setup, I ended up keeping this pattern here. This is basically the label used over here. It's just kind of a little bit larger to fill this space. And you can see when this pops down, we get the same pattern here. So the line that's going underneath this label is going underneath here. And ultimately, I actually just kind of like that look a little bit better personally. I feel like it kind of helps things to feel a little bit more orderly as you work your way down, and this just works as a slightly larger title for this section of the page. Beyond that, setting up this content here is very simple. We've got a headline. Again, we're using our primary text as well as our sub-headline to set the price. And I like to do this whenever possible because I can use relative sizing and spacing to set these things up to be relational. And then we've got a simple button with a little bit of text. Oh, and the one difference I do have on this headline, one tiny bit of custom CSS, is for our large breakpoint. So when this screen is like this, I've added a bit of top margin here just to kind of line up the bottom of this text with the bottom of these images. Because if we look again at our reference, you'll see the text is really lining up with the bottom of these images. So we want to keep that same look there. But then on mobile, we want to get rid of that top margin so that it's lined up appropriately. Yeah, so that's basically the comparison table. A little bit going on, but hopefully you can see it's really not too crazy. It's mostly about finding these patterns and just deciding kind of from the onset before you get too deep into it, how do I want to set this up? Because we could slice this a lot of different ways. It's really just your personal preference. And to me, kind of having this nested row of 50-50 after I realized that this never went to a single column, that just felt best to me, and I kind of worked the layout backwards from there. Finally, we have a bit of a closing section here that just kind of ends the page out. And actually, as of just yesterday, this section was different. It had this image, so kind of funny to see how these sites are always working on things, testing different stuff. But as of yesterday, it was basically this layout. Had a 50-50 setup, had our text to the side, we've got our image, and basically on mobile, this responds down to a single column layout. Now I'm using my action class here again. We've got our row with our two buttons, our AA actions class. That's the same from up here. And again, if I click into this row, you'll see we're using the auto spacing. Pretty much everything about this is exactly the same as up here. The only difference is I made my gap a little bit wider here. And again, that was just a personal preference thing. It felt a little bit better to be wider down here, so it works. And the only style it's really getting is from this page level CSS of 22 pixels on these much larger screen sizes. So I use the page level stuff for anything that is shared amongst sections, and then I will typically isolate stuff to a section just to kind of keep it siloed a little bit more, and especially for these demos, just to help you all process kind of what's going on a little bit better. So there you have it. That's basically the Apple AirPods page as it currently stands, built out in Pro. I'm very happy with how it came together. I hope you guys got something out of this video. We love bringing you all these kind of educational videos, just showing you kind of a real world example and breaking it down for you all to see how you might use some of these techniques in your own designs and your own setups down the road. So thank you all for watching. We really appreciate it. There is a very stripped down sort of derivative version of this page that will be available in Design Cloud. It will of course have none of the original copy or assets or anything like that, but it will just have a very stripped down kind of derivative setup for you all to play around with and see things a little more hands-on. So if you want to play around with that, that will be in Design Cloud when this video goes up.